The exclusion zone. The water went completely flat the moment I crossed the boundary line. Net come flat, like glass, like something had been waiting for me to stop moving. I want to be precise about what kind of person I was before last October, because the kind of person I was is relevant to how long it took me to accept what I was experiencing as something other than instrument error or observer bias. I am a marine biologist 7 years into a career defined by methodical data collection and a deep professional skepticism toward conclusions that outrun their evidence. I take water samples. I log temperatures. I cross-reference readings against historical baselines, and I write reports that other people use to make policy decisions about coastal ecosystems. I have spent more hours than I can count alone on the water in a 14-foot aluminum skiff in the specific gray, choppy, aggressive conditions of the Pacific Northwest coast, and I am not a person who startles easily or who reaches for extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones are available. I am telling you this because everything I am about to describe I first tried to explain as equipment malfunction, and then as perceptual error from working alone in deteriorating weather, and then as a combination of both, and I kept trying those explanations until the oar struck something solid 40 feet off shore of an island the EPA has officially designated as a protected bird sanctuary and has never in any public record I have been able to access adequately explained. The permit my university had secured was narrow and specific water sampling at exactly 100 yards from the shoreline of a small unnamed landmass on the Pacific Northwest coast, designated in official EPA documentation as an exclusion zone. The public-facing explanation was endangered nesting birds, which is the kind of explanation that is just plausible enough to end most inquiries and just vague enough to cover a wide range of actual reasons. I had no particular reason to doubt it. I was there for agricultural run-off data, not for the island itself. The sky was overcast in the specific way Pacific Northwest October skies are overcast, not threatening, just settled, a low solid ceiling of cloud that compresses is the light and makes to in the afternoon feel like dusk. The water was running to foot swells, the bow of the skiff slapping rhythmically the outboard motor at the particular pitch I could monitor unconsciously after years of working alone. Everything was exactly as it should be, which is why the transition was so immediately and completely wrong. I crossed the 100-yard mark and the water went flat. Not gradually, not in the way that water comes in the lee of a landmass when geography red erects the wind. In a single boat length, the swells simply stopped. The surface behind me was moving in the normal way of coastal Pacific water in October, and the surface ahead of me was motionless, dark, slightly reflective plane that looked denser than water should look, that the bow of my skiff entered with a different resistance than the cha. I had been crossing a slight viscosity that registered through the hole before I killed the engine to take the first sample. The silence that came when the motor stopped was not the comparative quiet of calm water after rough water. It was the silence of a space from which sound had been removed. No gulls, and there are always gulls. No wind through the pines on the island, and the trees were dense and close enough that there should have been something. No water movement against the hull. The blood in my ears was the loudest thing in the environment. The water temperature when I reached the collection vial over the side was wrong by several degrees colder than any reading I had taken in that area across multiple prior sampling trips, colder than the seasonal baseline by a margin that would require unusual conditions to explain. And it had a smell. Metallic and organic simultaneously, the smell of copper in contact with something biological, faint but distinct and entirely inconsistent with the open coastal water it should have been. I logged it. I took the sample. I lowered the depth finder and watched the screen render the sonar data from the bottom. The shapes were not geological. I am familiar with the zone. Our signatures of rocky coastal seafloor, irregular, asymmetrical, the jagged profile of natural formation. What the screen showed me were rectangular columns rising from the bottom, symmetrical, arranged in a pattern that the display resolved as concentric rings. I tapped the screen. The instrument recalibrated and read the same image. Then the zone, a registered movement, a single dense mass, unified for a fish school, large, moving upward from the bottom with the slow deliberateness of something ascending intentionally rather than drifting. I watched the depth numbers decrease. I looked up at the island. There was a figure on the beach. Too far for facial detail, but not too far for proportion, and the proportions were wrong in ways that distance alone does not produce. Too tall the limbs, too long in relation to the trunk, hanging with a looseness that suggested either extreme relaxation or an absence of the muscular tension that bodies maintain at rest. It was wearing something pale that moved slightly in air that contained no wind. I reached for my binoculars. The moment I brought them to my eyes and found the figure in the lens, it turned, not turned, snapped a single frame shift from facing away to facing directly at me, the head moving with a speed and lack of transitional motion that the neck can, at prod, in a living thing. The face in the binoculars was a pale, smooth, undifferentiated surface. No features I could resolve at that distance and with that light, or no features at all. It walked into the water, not carefully, not navigating the rocks, but moving with a fluid continuity that made no concession to terrain or surface, and it entered the water without displacement, without splash, without any of the turbulence that a body entering water at that pace should produce. Then it was gone below the surface, and the water where it had entered showed nothing. I pulled the starter cord on the outboard. The engine turned over and died. I pulled again, and got nothing, not even the partial catches that indicate a flooded engine. The depth finder was alarming the mass on the zone, or was now 20 feet below the hull and closing. The water around the boat began to change. Not boiling, not disturbed, pressurized from below, a slow up, welling that raised the surface level around the hull in a way that physics requires a significant displaced volume to produce. The air temperature had dropped enough that my breath was visible. I unclamped the emergency oar and put it in the water and pushed. The oar struck something. Not the bottom, the water was 40 feet deep, and the oar was 4 feet long. Something between the bottom and the surface, solid, and slightly yielding the specific resistance of dense organic material rather than rock or debris. The hull lurched upward, lifted not by a wave. There were no waves, lifted from below by something with enough mass and intention to raise a 14-foot aluminum skiff and its contents clear of the waterline. I went to the floor. Against the underside of the hull, through the thin aluminum, I felt contact distributed, moving the sensation of multiple points of pressure, traveling slowly along the length of the boat, from stern to bow, the way you feel the hull when you run your hand along it from outside, but from beneath, and with a deliberateness that was not incidental. The water was rising along the sides of the hull, climbing against gravity, the level at the gunwale increasing without the hull sinking. I got the oar under me and pushed against what was below, and the boat moved, slid forward, and the resistance released. The bow hit a swell. Salt water across the face, the wind snapping my jacket, a gull screaming overhead. The engine started on the first pull. I looked at the console, GPS functioning normal coordinate. its depth finder showing a rocky bottom at 80 feet. No anomalous readings. I looked back over my shoulder. The boundary was visible as the line between moving water and the flat dark mirror I had crossed it. And inside it, the surface was exactly as it had been, and the beach was empty and nothing disturbed the surface of the dead water. I did not stop watching it until the island was below the horizon. The water samples came back clean, within normal parameters on every metric, which means that whatever produced the temperature differential and the metallic smell at the sample site left no chemical trace in the vial, or left a trace that the standard ASCII panel doesn't test for. The sonar logs are a different matter. I have had the data reviewed by 2 colleagues I trust, independently without telling either of them what I experienced during collection. Both identified the structural formations on the bottom as inconsistent with natural geological processes. One described the arrangement as appearing engineered. Neither could account for the moving mass, which appears in the log as a single return to dense and coherent to be biological in origin at that scale. The second colleague asked where I had taken the reading, and I told her, and she was quiet for a moment. And then she said she had heard the site mentioned before in a context she described as informal by someone who worked in a regulatory capacity she declined to specify, and that the designation of the area as a bird sanctuary was not the original designation, and that she did not know what the original designation had been or when it had changed. I have submitted a request through my university for access to the original EPA filings for the site. The request was acknowledged and then not responded to for 11 weeks, at which point I received a letter stating that the relevant documents were under ongoing regulatory review and not available for public access at this time. I have since made the same request through 3 different channels. The responses have been variations of the same language. I still have the sonar logs. The data is what it is, and it does not require my account of the day to be accurate. It or credible. It stands on its own as a record of what the instrument detected at that location on that date. What the instrument detected at 40 feet below the hull was a large, dense, unified mass moving upward at a controlled rate from a seafloor that appears in the topographic data to be resting on something rather than anchored to it. I do not know what that something is. I do not know whether the figure on the beach was related to the mass below the boat, or whether they were separate phenomena that occupied the same space simultaneously. I do not know whether the calm water inside the boundary line is a consistent feature of that site, or whether it was specific to that day and those conditions. What I know is that the boundary was real in a way that a bird sanctuary designation does not explain, that something below the hull of my boat made contact with the hull from outside, and that the EPA has sealed the original site filings in language that is used for ongoing regulatory review and not for routine conservation management. Those 3 things are consistent with each other in a way that the official explanation is not. I do not know what they are consistent with instead. I have been trying for 7 months to find out, and the record, wherever I find its edge, stops. The data does not lie. I keep coming back to that. The data does not lie, and the data shows something beneath that island that is organized and large and capable of controlled vertical movement and aware enough of what is above it to respond when something crosses the boundary line. Whatever the EPA knew when they filed the original designation, they knew enough to draw a line in the water and seal the paperwork. I think about the figure entering the ocean without displacement, without sound, without any of the physics that submersion requires. I think about what it means for something to exist below water in a way that leaves no surface trace. I think about the arrangement of columns on the sonar are concentric symmetrical, the geometry of intention, and about how long something would have to be there to build to that scale, and whether it was already there when the first designation was filed, or whether the filing was a response to something that had already been there for much longer than the EPA has existed to designate it. I have not returned to the site. I have requested reassignment and received it. I take my samples in different waters now in areas with full zone, records and normal bottom topography and sea, gulls and wind, and I am grateful for all of it in a way I was not before October. But I keep the zone, logs. Partly because they are data and discarding data is not something I do professionally, and partly because I think someone should have a record of what the instruments found down there in case the regulatory review concludes in a direction that results in the official record being adjusted. Something is underneath that island. It knows the boundary line exists. It knew when I crossed it. And whatever it is doing down there in the concentric columns beneath the flat dark water, it has been doing it long enough to stop being surprised by visitors and to know exactly how long it needs to hold on before they leave. My drone went down on an abandoned military island 2 miles offshore. When I paddled out to find it, someone had taken it apart and laid the pieces out in a perfect row. There are no boats that go there. There hasn't been anyone on that island since 1948. I want to start with the practical reality of losing a $5,000 piece of equipment, because that is what drove every decision I made that day, and I want you to understand the calculus before you judge the choice is. The hexacopter was custom-built cinematic camera rig, high-end stabilization, the kind of setup that takes months of income to justify and years to configure correctly. It was not replaceable with an insurance claim because I fly independent and the policy has an exclusion clause for operations over open water that my broker had flagged when I signed it, and that I had noted and accepted because the alternative was not taking ocean jobs, and the ocean jobs paid well. When the feed went black and the connection dropped 2 miles offshore, the first thing I thought was not anything about what I had seen in the last clear frame of footage. The first thing I thought was that I needed to get that drone back. The contract was for coastal erosion documentation along a remote stretch of the eastern seaboard, including establishing shots of a small archipelago and a specific rock formation known locally as Battery Island, a World War II coastal defense outpost, decommissioned in 1948 and subsequently left to what the official record describes as natural reclamation. The structures had been removed from most navigational maps, which I noted because it meant I was working from coordinates. It's rather than charted reference is, and the island had no regular boat access, no tours, no ferry service, no reason for civilian traffic. From the mainland cliff where I launched, the conditions looked ideal: clear sky, good visibility, steady wind from the west that my telemetry confirmed was within operational parameters. I watched the drone feed on my monitor as the hexacopter crossed the 2 miles of open Atlantic. The glitch started as the drone came within range of the main bunker complex at 50 feet altitude. Not signal degradation, which I know well, the image fractured int. Horizontal interference lines in colors that don't correspond to any compression artifact I've encountered in 7 years of professional operation. Magenta and green banding that looked more like a CRT being hit with a strong electromagnetic field than a digital dropout. The telemetry went simultaneously, the altimeter cycling through values that had no relationship to each other or to reality, the GPS coordinate. It's skipping the orientation data spinning. I initiated the return to home protocol immediately, which registered on the controller as accepted and produced no response from the drone. It sat wherever it was not responding to any input, While the camera gimbal moved on its own, a hard mechanical jerk upward off the bunker it had been framing, repositioning toward the roof of the tallest structure. The interference cleared for approximately 1 second. The frame was sharp. The roof of the bunker, the sky behind it, and in the center of the frame, a figure very tall, very thin, the proportions wrong in a way that was clear even at that resolution and distance, wrapped in something that the camera rendered as dark and layered and textured in a way that I later and reluctantly decided was consistent with chains. It was facing the drone. Then the feed cut to black and stayed there. I spent 20 minutes trying to re-establish connection. Then I checked the last confirmed GPS position, which placed the drone in the center of Battery Island, and I went to find a kayak. The paddle took just over 2 hours. The water was cold and the chup was manageable, and I had time to think about what I had seen in that last second of footage and to work through the explanations: a trespasser, a historical reenactor, some kind of installation or sculpture on the roof that the interference had distorted into a shape my visual cortex had resolved as a figure. These explanations held their shape reasonably well for the first hour. The second hour, as the island grew, from a dark smear on the horizon into a specific set of shapes, crumbling concrete bunkers half buried in overgrowth, the ruins of a structure that had been designed to withstand artillery, and had instead been defeated by 50 years of salt air and vegetation, the explanations started losing their conviction, and by the time I pulled the kayak onto the gravel beach they were mostly gone. The silence was the first thing that registered as specifically wrong, rather than just atmospherically unpleasant. I have worked in remote coastal environments for 7 years, and silence in those environments is relative. There are always birds, always the sounds of small animals, always the particular acoustic texture of a living ecosystem, even when no large animals are visible. Battery Island had none of it. No birds on the rocks, no crabs in the tide pools, no barnacles on the concrete pilings at the waterline where barnacles establish themselves on any fixed surface in salt water within weeks. The ecological dead zone that biologists describe around certain types of contaminated sites. The specific absence that means something is wrong with the substrate at a fundamental level. The smell confirmed it ozone and something organic underneath it, the metallic copper smell that I associate it from research with water that has been in contact with specific types of microbial activity or chemical leaching for extended periods. Wrong for an open coastal site. Wrong for the conditions. Present and consistent as I moved inland, the controller was picking up a faint signal from the drone, localized close. I followed it through the trench system, the concrete walls 8 feet high on both sides, blocking the sky, the ground between them, a mat of dead brown grass that hadn't grew. And with the season, the doorways into the subterranean sections dark in a way that my flashlight didn't fully resolve at any distance. The signal led me to the main courtyard, the open area in front of the largest bunker. The drone was there. It had not crashed. A crashed drone looks a specific way: impact damage, bent props, cracked casing, the scatter pattern of components that detach on impact. The hexacopter was resting on a concrete slab in the center of the courtyard, and it had been disassembled. The 6 propellers removed from their motors and laid in a straight row, evenly spaced. The camera gimbal detached from the body at the mounting screws and placed 6 inches to the left. The battery removed and set apart from the main body at a precise distance. The components that required tool access to reach had been accessed and removed, not forced, not broken, removed correctly, the way a technician removes them in the correct sequence without damaging the threads or the housings. Whatever had taken my drone apart had known how it was put together. I was looking at this and trying to find the version of events that produced it without requiring me to accept that something had been on that island when I lost the feed, and that it had been waiting in the courtyard by the time I arrived. The fog came over the courtyard walls before I had finished processing what I was looking at. Not from the ocean, from the concrete itself seeping through the porous surface of the walls in a way that fog does not behave, filling the courtyard from the walls inward rather than rolling across the ground. Visibility dropped to 10 feet in under a minute. Temperature with it, my breath clouding in front of me in a way that it had not been a minute before. I was putting the components into my back pack as fast as I could manage with hands that had started shaking badly when the sound started. I know what an air raid siren sounds like from recordings, and from the mechanical examples that still exist in certain coastal towns. The sound that came from somewhere in the fog-obscured bunker structure was the same type of sound running in reverse, not a descending wail, but an ascending one starting below the threshold of hearing as a vibration in the concrete under my feet and rising through a pitch range that did something specific to the fluid pressure in my inner ear, the physical sensation of a frequency that the body responds to before the mind processes it. The footsteps started at the same time. Behind me, in the dead grass of the courtyard, heavy and metallic, the weight and cadence of something large moving on 2 points of contact. Not faster than my breathing, exactly synchronized with it, 1 step per breath, as though whatever was back there had calibrated its pace to my respiratory rate, and was maintaining the interval with precision. I did not look back. I made that decision consciously in the way you make decisions when you understand that the information you would gain is not worth the cost of the moment's delay. I ran through the trench system by memory and by the feel of the concrete walls under my hands, the siren still ascending behind me and the footsteps maintaining their distance, not closing, not falling back, the same interval, patient and consistent. I hit the beach and got the kayak into the water and paddled until my arms stopped working properly, and when I looked back, the island was inside its fog bank and the surface of the water beat. Between us was normal Atlantic water, choppy and cold and grey and alive in the way that the water around Battery Island had not been. At the hotel I reassembled the drone from the components in my backpack and checked the memory card, which was still seated in its slot. The flight footage was gone, not corrupted, not partially recoverable, simply absent from the file system, as though it had never been written. There was one file on the card, an audio recording 3 hours and 11 minutes in length, which was the duration from my landing on the beach to my departure from it. I know this because I checked my watch when I pulled the kayak ashore and checked it again when I launched. The recording was my breathing, 3 hours of it, my specific respiratory pattern, recognizable to me in the particular way you recognize your own voice in a recording, the slight irregularity at the top of each inhale, the pattern I know from years of listening to my own audio from on-camera work. My breathing recorded from very close proximity for the entire duration of my time on the island. Underneath it, consistent throughout, the sound of chains. Not constant rhythmic, the slow heavy movement of chain link against chain link. The sound of significant weight being shifted at regular intervals, patient and unhurried, for 3 hours and 11 minutes. I sold the equipment the following week. I took a significant loss on the sale, and I did not negotiate. I do not fly over open water any more, and I do not take contracts that require me to document and decommissioned military sites, and when clients ask why I have those restrictions, I tell them it is an insurance requirement, which is easier than the truth and produces the same outcome. I have thought many times about what was on the roof of that bunker in the last clear frame before I lost the feed, and about what disassembled the drone in the courtyard between the moment I lost the signal and the moment I arrived 2 hours later, and about what walked behind me through the fog at the pace of my own breathing. I have thought about whether the recording was made by something that followed me through the island, or by something that had been following me since before I landed, or by something that does not need to follow, because it is already wherever the person it is watching happens to be. I have not been able to settle on an answer. I have settled instead on the restriction, and on not looking at the file again, and on accepting that some contracts are not worth the fee regardless of what the fee is. The equipment is replaceable. I understand now that other things are not, and that Battery Island, whatever it has been since 1948, when the last documented human beings left it, is very clear about the terms under which it accepts visitors, and very consistent about ensuring that they understand those terms before they leave. If you find a memory card wrapped in black electrical tape, washed up on a beach, do not look at what is on it. I am not being dramatic. I am telling you the thing I wish someone had told me before I paddled out to that island, which is that some recordings are made for the subject rather than the audience, and that playing them back is not a passive act. It is a response. And whatever made that recording on Battery Island has been waiting since 1948 for someone to respond. The storm shelter. I've been fishing these waters for 30 years. When the squall hit, Blackwood Island was my only option. The lighthouse keeper's cottage had been abandoned since 1952. The coffee on the table was still hot. Let me tell you about Blackwood Island before I tell you what happened there, because the island has a context that matters and that the people who know it don't usually explain to people who don't, because in coastal fishing communities, certain knowledge is assumed to be ambient and certain warnings are assumed to have been absorbed before they become relevant. Blackwood Island is a rock formation in the Atlantic, jagged and inhospitable, the kind of geography that exists to destroy things rather than support them. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, it was used as a quarantine colony. People who were sick and people who were suspected of being sick brought there by boat, and left the ones who died buried in unmarked graves on the northern bluff, because the records from that period are incomplete and the burials were done by whoever was still standing and didn't have the resource is for markers. The lighthouse was automated in 1982, and the keeper's cottage has been empty since the last keeper left in the early 50s. The Coast Guard does maintenance on the automated systems during daylight hours. They do not send crews there after dark. Nobody I have ever spoken to in 30 years of working these waters has offered me a direct explanation for that policy, and I have stopped asking because the harbor master's expression when I raised the subject once was the kind of expression that ends that line of questioning. I have been commercial fishing for 29 years. I know the currents, the shoals, the storm patterns, the specific way the barometric pressure behaves in this section of the Atlantic in November, when a system comes in from the northeast faster than the meteorological service has triangulate. 2 Novembers ago I was out deep when a squall developed with a speed that I have not seen matched before, or since pressure dropping so fast my ears registered it before the instruments confirmed it. The sky going from overcast to the specific bruised iron color, that means you have very little time to make a decision. The waves were building to 20 feet by the time I had the decision made. My engine was running hot, the bilge pump was working harder than I wanted, and the distance to the mainland harbor was not a distance I was going to cover in those conditions in a boat, with those problems. Blackwood Island was 4 miles closer, and had a cove on the leeward side with the remains of the old quarantine dock. I know that cove. I have used it as a reference point for navigation for 3 decades. I had never had a reason to approach it. I got the trawler int the cove and tied off to the pilings which were rat it but held and assessed the situation. The lines could part in the worst of it and put the boat on the rocks. Staying aboard during peak conditions without a working engine to manage position was not a good option. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was the only standing structure. I took my emergency kit and my flashlight and ran for it through rain that was coming down hard enough to reduce visibility to 20 feet. The door was swollen in its frame and took a shoulder to open. I got it shut behind me and stood in the dark and let my flashlight find the room. The interior was what 50-plus years of abandonment in a salt air environment produces: bowed floors, peeling wallpaper, furniture under cloths that had gone gray and stiff, the smell of mildew and rat, and the particular damp that gets into wood that has been wet and dried and wet again for decades. Dust on every horizontal surface in the thick uniform layer of a place where no air moves and nothing disturbs it. I took this inventory because I am a person who takes inventory of spaces. I enter 30 years of working in environments where missing a detail can matter. I noted the dust. I noted the condition of the floors, testing them with my weight before crossing. I noted the location of the windows and the door and the rear access. I went to the kitchen because kitchens in old structures sometimes have a gas line that can provide heat, and because I was wet and cold and thinking practically. The mug was on the kitchen table. A ceramic mug sitting in the center of a table whose surface had the same thick dust layer as every other horizontal surface in the building, except for a small circle beneath the mug where the dust was absent, a clean ring on the table, the size of the mug's base, as though it had been placed there recently enough that dust had not yet settled in it. The cleared area. I walked toward it, and I could see the steam before I was close enough to touch it. A thin wisp of it in the beam of my flashlight. I put my hand around the mug, and it was hot in the way that a fresh poured drink is hot, not warm the way something retains warmth for a while, but actively had the ceramic warm to hold comfortably the liquid inside, still at the temperature of something recently heated. Black coffee. I stood in that kitchen with a hot cup of coffee in my hand, and rain hammering the windows and the storm shrieking outside, and I did what I do when something is wrong and I don't yet understand how it's wrong, which is I go through the possible explanations methodically. Someone else sheltering, a Coast Guard crew who got caught in the same squall, a researcher with a permit. I called out. My voice went into the building and came back without any response, and the building was not large, and I would have heard movement if there was anyone in it to make movement. The radio came on while I was still standing at the table. An old wooden console model, the kind of furniture-sized radio that pre-dates the transistor, no power cord visible, no connection to anything. The static was immediate, it and loud in the quiet room, and then it resolved into the NOAA Marine weather broadcast, that specific automated monotone I have been listening to on working radios for 30 years, the voice that reads coordinates and wind speeds and wave heights. Except that is not what it was reading. It was reading my name, my full name, my boat's name, my age. It was reading what sounded like a recovery report. The language of the incident summaries the Coast Guard files when they find a boat and a body, the specific bureaucratic phrasing I have heard read out at memorial service is for men. I worked beside the phrasing that means someone is not coming home. My name in that phrasing, and a date for the recovery that was tomorrow's date. I have 30 years of experience making decisions quickly in bad conditions. I understand the relationship between information and action, and I understand when the time for gathering more information has passed. I backed away from the radio and I was turning toward the door when the lighthouse lamp came on above me. Not white, not the standard navigational spectrum. A violet light, pale and pulsing at a frequency that did something to my visual processing in the way that certain frequencies do. Not quite stripping, but close enough to the threshold that the shadows the light through. The broken windows appeared to move independently of any light source motion. The radio cut to static and stopped. The room went back to my flashlight. I turned around. The mug was gone, where it had been cut into. The surface of the writing table with fresh edges, the wood still pale at the cuts, rather than darkened with age and moisture. 3 words. I did not stay to consider them at length. I registered them. They are not something I am going to reproduce here, because I have found that some things are better not repeated, not because they have power in themselves, but because precision about them pulls attention toward the wrong part of the story. The front door opened. I had jammed it shut with the iron doorstep from beside the hearth. The wind did not come through when it opened. The rain did not blow in across the threshold the way rain blows through every opening in a storm of that intensity. A vacuum in the doorway rather than a pressure differential, the storm outside audible but not entering, and in the doorway, a figure in a yellow fisherman's slicker with the hood up, standing in the rain without the rain behaving normally around it, without any of the physical relationship to the storm environment that a body in a storm should have. I put my flashlight on it. Yellow slicker, identical to mine, the same manufacturer, the same model, the reflective strip at the same height. It reached up and pushed the hood back, and what was under the hood was pale skin and nothing else. Not obscured by darkness, not ambiguous. Simply absent. The face as a surface with no features, smooth from hairline to jaw. Uniformly pale, the head shaped correctly, and everything that should have been on it missing. It stepped into the room. One deliberate. Its step unhurried, weight shifting in the way weight shifts when something is moving toward a specific location rather than simply moving. It raised one hand and pointed at the table where the coffee had been and where the words were cut now. I went out through the kitchen window. I don't remember making the decision to choose the window over the door. My body made it, and I was outside in the rain and the mud with shattered glass on my coat before I had consciously processed the choice. I ran to the dock. I threw the lines and cranked the engine, which started, and I drove the trawler in. The squall and I did not look at the island again until it was behind me, and by then the violet light from the lighthouse had stopped pulsing. I made port the following morning, the boat taking on water at the harbor mouth, the engine failing on the approach. I tied up and went to find the harbor master, an old man who has known these waters longer than I have, and who has the specific gravity of someone who has absorbed a great deal of information he wished he didn't have. I told him where I had sheltered. I told him about the coffee and the radio, and what the radio had said. I told him about what came through the door. He listened without interrupting, which is not his usual manner. When I finished, he asked me one question: whether I had drunk the coffee. I told him I had not. He exhaled in a way that I have been thinking about for 2 years. Not relief exactly, but the specific release of a tension that had been held in anticipation of a worse answer. He said that was good. He said the last fisherman who had sheltered there had drunk whatever was offered. He said they found that man a week later, his boat tied in his home slip, the man himself below the waterline of his own vessel in water that had no business being there. He didn't tell me what Blackwood Island was, or what had been on it since before the quarantine colony, or what the quarantine colony's connection to it was. He didn't tell me why the Coast Guard policy exists or what the policy is actually protecting. He turned away after he told me about the last fisherman, and he has not raised the subject again, and I have not raised it with him. What I understand from 30 years of working with men who keep the kind of knowledge that keeps other people alive is that the harbor master told me exactly as much as he calculated was necessary for me to have, and that what he did not tell me he withheld for reasons that are in my interest to respect rather than circumvent. I have gone over the event many times in the 2 years since. Not the figure in the doorway, which I have made my peace with in the way you make peace with something you cannot explain and cannot change. What I keep returning to is the coffee, the specific fact of it freshly hot on a table in a building that has been empty for 70 years, in a storm that I had not forecast, and that the meteorological service had not predicted, on an island that no one approaches. Something had made that coffee in the time between the last possible moment. It could have been made by any person who arrived before me and the moment I walked through the door. Something had been there waiting with the specific preparation of something that knew I was coming before I knew I was going there, that understood what I would need after coming in cold and wet from a failing boat in a November squall, that had made the offering and waited in the other room for me to find it. The coffee was not a threat. The words cut into the table and the thing in the doorway, those were what came after the offer was not accepted. The coffee was hospitality, the specific, warm, practical hospitality of something that had learned across however many years of receiving stranded fishermen through that door exactly what to prepare for them. And I have thought on the nights when I think about it most clearly about what it means to be the thing behind that door, watching sailor after sailor come in cold and frightened and alone, and understanding them well enough to know what they need and waiting to see whether they will take it, and what it has learned from the ones who did. I still fish these waters. I know where Blackwood Island is the way I know all the hazards by exact position, by the way the current runs past it, by the color of the water over the northern shoal in certain light. I give it a wider berth than I used to. When November comes and the weather turns, I watch the pressure readings more carefully than I did before. And if I am ever again caught out deep in a squall with a failing engine, and nowhere to shelter except that cove on the leeward side, I have already made the decision that I will take the storm over the cottage, and the open water over the dock. The ocean, at its worst, is a thing I understand. What came through that door wearing my face was not, and I have learned in 30 years of working in unforgiving environments that the most important skill is knowing the difference between a risk you can manage and a situation you cannot, and leaving the second category alone regardless of what it offers you. The harbor master's question stays with me, not as a warning, I don't need the warning any more, but as a measure of what he knew and what he expected. He didn't ask what I saw. He didn't ask what the radio said. He asked whether I had drunk the coffee, because that was the only variable that mattered, the only fork in the sequence where the outcome was still undetermined. Everything else he already knew the shape of. He had asked that question before. I am certain he had asked it before. And the fact that he still exhaled the way he did when I said no tells me that the answer is not always no, and that what happens to the ones who say yes is something that the harbor at Blackwood Island sees more of than the record shows, because some loss is get filed as weather and some boats get found with cause, is that the report calls undetermined and some fisher in simply don't come back, and the sea is large and the sea takes people, and there is no investigation that reaches as far as a quarantine island where the dead are buried in unmarked graves, and the coffee is always fresh, and the lighthouse burns violet in the dark.